We are now closing in on being 3/4 of the way through the NHL as we go team by team looking at each team's outlook for the expansion draft of the Seattle Kraken coming up this summer. And with each one of these videos, as is the case with any video I make, I try to do my best to do my homework ahead of time to make sure I'm providing you with the best possible content I can. But mistakes do happen. I have pronounced a couple of names wrong here and there, and of course the everlasting march of time has made a fool of me over the course of this season at least a couple of times now. But even without that, there are also plenty of opinions that go into making these videos, which people have been more than happy to disagree with here and there, which, when presented in an adult manner anyway, I openly invite and even enjoy interacting with. Either way though, when it comes to today's team, I don't think that's something I'll probably have to worry about too much, as this is one of the more obscure, lesser known teams in the NHL that people frequently forget about. And even the few fans that they do have are well known for being cool, calm, and collected, which is why this is one of the most beloved teams by every fan base all across the NHL. Yes, we are of course talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Okay, if you are a little bit newer to the NHL and don't know otherwise, I may have been a touch sarcastic there just a second ago. The Leafs are the biggest team in the NHL with the biggest fan base, and are also one of the best teams this year, which is not something that they've been able to say all that frequently over the last few decades. On top of that, it has also been quite a while, to say the least, since the Leafs won the Stanley Cup, so you can imagine how riled up this fanbase is to finally once again have a legitimate Stanley Cup contending team. As far as Seattle's concerned though, none of that really matters. All that they really care about is who they can take from this team once the season is over, regardless of how it ends for Toronto. But when it comes to that, even with the Leafs being all in on this season, and again them being one of the league's better teams, the Kraken aren't going to have quite the wealth of opportunity in the expansion draft that they might see from some of the other top teams across the league, like the Avalanche and Lightning, just to name a couple. And on top of that, with the number of expiring contracts that the Leafs have, especially on the forward end, there are still a lot of questions that have to be answered as far as who will even be left exposed with a contract. Regardless of what happens though, with the amount of talent that Toronto has on the forward end, that I would imagine they'd want to keep around for Stanley Cup runs in the future, or at least to make it past the first round of the playoffs beyond this season, I do think it's fairly likely that they'll end up going the 7-3-1 protection route. Which means on the forward end, with guys like Austin Matthews, John Tavares with his no movement clause, Mitch Marner, and William Nylander all being locks, they can also then protect 3 more guys, which right now I think both Zach Hyman and Alexander Kerfoot are pretty likely to get 2 of those 3 spots. And yes, I know Hyman's a UFA at the end of the season at this point, but Toronto does have some extensions they need to sign before the expansion draft, so I'm going to go ahead and have him protected. Then that 7th and final slot, at least at this point, probably is still most likely to go to Pierre Engval, who does have a contract through next year. Though he has had a bit of a rough season this year, or at least not quite up to what people probably expected from him, so that might not be a full lock-in yet. Now, where things get complicated for Toronto on the forward end is that currently they only have 8 draft-eligible forwards with contracts through the 2022 season, and 2 of them haven't played enough games in order to fulfill the requirement of 2 exposed forwards with contracts through next year, as well as having played 54 games in the last 2 seasons or 27 in the current one. And with the Leafs having only a few games left before the playoffs, neither one of those guys is close enough to make it to that eligibility requirement of 27 games this year. All of which means that at the bare minimum, Toronto is going to have to sign 2 more forwards through next season before the expansion draft. Or if they want to expose Engval, they could just sign 1 more and he could also fill one of those 2 slots. Now, especially with how impressive Adam Brooks has looked on Toronto's 4th line in the few games he's gotten to play, there is the chance that he could earn his way into that 7th protection slot and that Engval could end up being exposed. So that is still definitely a possibility. On the defensive end though, things are much more straightforward for the Leafs, as they do have 4 eligible players under contract, which means they can go ahead with protecting Jake Muzzin, Morgan Rielly, and TJ Brodie, which then would leave Justin Holl and his contract that goes through 2023 exposed. Then in goal, where things may have once seemed straightforward that they would probably re-sign Anderson and protect him, it may have gotten a little bit more complicated with the Leafs with the performance of Jack Campbell this season. Complicated enough, in fact, that, at least to me, especially with Anderson being set to be a UFA at the end of the season, I think the Leafs might go ahead and protect Campbell here, and then if they do want Anderson back, go ahead and try to re-sign him after the expansion draft has happened before he hits the market of free agency. Of course, they could also just let Anderson go in free agency, which then would leave Rittich as their backup, but that hasn't gone particularly well so far with him in Toronto, so I don't think that's particularly likely to happen. But going back to the defensemen for just a second before we start talking about the players that could be available for the Kraken to select from, there still is a decent chance that TJ Brodie doesn't get that third protection slot, and instead they go with Hull or an extended Travis Dermott. So then as far as the players that this protection list would leave open for the Kraken to pick from, again, there aren't as many as you might expect from a team that has been as good as Toronto has this season. And on top of that, there still is quite a lot to be determined on the forward end as far as who could be under contract through next season. Especially considering, once again, the only eligible guy on the forward end that does have a contract through next year, and also the number of games played to meet those exposure requirements that could even possibly be exposed in my eyes, would be Pierre Engval. And with Engval, with him only having 15 points on 8 goals and 7 assists in 48 games last year, it's not like the Leafs were probably expecting him to come in this season and put up 20 goals or anything like that, but they also were probably expecting more than the 9 points that he's put up in the 38 games that he has played this season. So I definitely don't think it would be surprised to see Engval exposed so that Toronto could make room on the protection list for another one of their younger forwards. But still, with Engval also being just 24 years old and having significantly more NHL experience at this point, I do think that he at least has the inside track as things stand right now for that 7th slot. But if he were to lose his spot on this protection list at this point, I think it would probably most likely be to Adam Brooks. The 24-year-old center has come up this season and played in 8 games where he has 5 points on 4 goals and 1 assist. Now, Brooks doesn't have a whole lot of NHL experience to add to the 8 games he's played this year, with just 7 games last season to add to it where he had 3 points on 3 assists. But at the AHL level, he has looked pretty good over the last 3 seasons at the very least. After a couple of massive seasons with the Regina Pats in the WHL that saw him score 250 points across 138 games between 2015 and 2017, his first season with the Marlies the following year was not all that impressive with just 19 points in 57 games. But over the last 3 years, he's definitely bounced back, scoring 73 points on 34 goals and 39 assists in the 107 games he played there over the last 3 seasons. All while skating on ice zambonied by none other than David Ayres. Now, obviously, with just 15 games played over the last couple of years, Brooks still has a lot to prove when it comes to showing that he can be a consistent producer at the NHL level. But it has been a promising start for him so far to this point in his young career. But for the Kraken, the impressive start that he's had to his career is not the only thing that could make him a draw to the team when it comes to the expansion draft, because he also does have a contract that still goes through the 2022 season before he's set to be an RFA. Again, for the Leafs though, when it comes to exposure requirements, he just doesn't have enough games played over the last couple of years or this season to help them there. Another young guy who could also be worth looking at for the Kraken that does also have a contract that goes through next season but without enough games played is Joey Anderson, who just played his first game for the Leafs. Though with this soon-to-be 23-year-old winger, he does have quite a bit more NHL experience to this point than Brooks does, having played in 52 games for the Devils over the 2 seasons leading up to this one, where he did have 13 points on 8 goals and 5 assists. So not necessarily quite the points production that Brooks has had so far, which is also true for him at the AHL level, but at least half of those points did come in 18 games last year, where the other half came in 34 games the previous year, which does show some improvement for, again, a pretty young player. As far as more experienced forwards are concerned, well, for the Leafs, then we would have to again start looking at some guys that are set to be UFAs at the end of the season as things stand right now. And even at that, there really aren't all that many tempting options. Really, to me, probably the most tempting one being Wayne Simmonds, who I actually probably could see getting extended by the Leafs. Even with that having been said, though, at this point, Simmonds is pushing 33 years old and is definitely towards the tail end of his career. So though he was for a long time a solid points producer for the Flyers, if he were to be the Kraken selection from the Leafs, I don't think that that's the role we should expect him to play in Seattle. Instead, he would be much more of a veteran locker room presence type of guy, which Seattle could definitely use a couple of those guys, but probably not from teams with other options as good as the Leafs do still have. And at this point, probably the leading candidate for selection would probably come from the defensive end in Justin Hall. The 29-year-old right-shotted defenseman has played in 132 NHL games across 4 seasons, where he has 40 points on 6 goals and 34 assists. Almost all of that coming in the last 2 seasons, where he had 18 points last year in 68 games, and now has 19 points in the 51 games he's played this season, including getting much more ice time each of the last 2 years, and especially this year. Now, it did take Hall quite a while to make it to the NHL level, and he hasn't necessarily been a standout player in any particular way for the Leafs, even with him being a mainstay part of the team over the last couple of years. But with that said, he's also been a pretty solid player all across the board for the last couple of seasons, with a decent amount of points production for a lower forward defenseman, especially this year, as well as getting in the way of quite a number of shots and also offering his fair share of physicality. Plus, when it comes to the possession stats, also being on the better side of those as well, even if just barely over the course of his career. So again, while I do think it's pretty safe to say that Hall probably wouldn't be a headline-making pick for the Kraken to take here, he probably would offer the most as far as a dependable, consistent producer for the Kraken, at least for the next couple of seasons. But if they did want to go more the route of taking a bit more of a chance on a younger guy that maybe could use a fresh start in a new city, then Travis Dermott might be the pick here, assuming he has a contract through 2022 at the very least. At 24 years old, Dermott has already played in 203 NHL games across 4 seasons for the Leafs, where he has 47 points on 11 goals and 36 assists. So with him, the worry is definitely that decline, or at the very least lack of improvement in points production over the 4 years he's been in the league. Though this year, which has definitely been his worst year from that aspect, he has done that with quite a bit less ice time per game. Even still though, 6 points in 46 games is definitely not what the Leafs were hoping for out of Dermott this season. Even with the lack of points production throughout the course of his career though, he still has been able to offer a respectable amount of block shots and a decent amount of physicality in his game, though again those have been lacking this season even with the reduced ice time. Statistically speaking anyway, pretty much the only part of his game that hasn't suffered significantly this season has been with his possession stats, but even with that having been said, he played much better there in his first 2 seasons than he has in the last 2. But even still in the last couple of years has been right around average to slightly above average in both Corsi for percentage and expected plus minus. But again, with him being just 24 years old and already having a decent amount of NHL experience, if when it comes to the expansion draft, the Kraken think that they could get a little bit more out of him or think a change of scenery might do him some good, he could be a solid pick if they can help him turn around his career. Though again, with Dermott set to be an RFA at the end of the season and the Leafs not at least required to sign any more defensemen before the expansion draft, him being the pick for Seattle probably hinges on whether or not he gets an extension before the draft shows up. Finally though, when it comes to the expansion draft, if left exposed, Jack Campbell could offer a pretty tempting option for Seattle to pick when it comes to Toronto. After spending a few seasons in LA as a backup goalie for the Kings, Campbell came over to Toronto midway through last season to serve as a much needed solid backup option for Frederick Anderson in net for the Leafs. But then with some issues staying healthy which followed him through the start of this season, he didn't really start to get some significant playing time until midway through this season, where then he all of a sudden made headlines by setting a franchise record with 11 straight wins for the Leafs in net. And even now, after he's gotten through a little bit of a cold streak, he still has 15 wins in the 18 games that he's played for the Leafs, with a .927 save percentage and just over 2 goals per game. Now, Frederick Anderson has for a while now been the starting goaltender for the Maple Leafs, and given Toronto's issue with finding consistent solid backup options for him, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that he has been a bit overused in his time in Toronto. And unfortunately for him, now that it seems the team is a legitimate contender for the Stanley Cup, he does seem to be showing some of those signs of those years and years of being a bit overused. Now with some injury issues of his own and a seeming decline in play on top of the fact that Campbell showed up and impressed in his time taking over for Anderson, all raising the question of whether or not Anderson is the goalie of the future for the Leafs. And with Anderson set to be UFA at the end of the season, that question is probably going to get answered in the next couple of months. If the Leafs do decide to extend him and keep him on for the future, then they probably will want to protect him and make sure that he stays in Toronto. But that would leave Campbell exposed. But if Campbell does impress in the playoffs or Anderson has another big stumble, it's not out of the question that Campbell could be looked at as the goalie of the future and end up getting this protection spot. If exposed though, especially considering the lack of huge amounts of other options, I don't think that Campbell would be all too terrible of a pick for Seattle to make here. In the end though, when it comes to the Leafs and the expansion draft, it does seem like Hull on the defensive end is probably the most dependable, solid pick that the Kraken could make here. But if they do want to go the route of taking a little bit more of a chance on the future of a younger player, then they could go with Adam Brooks on the forward end if he ends up being exposed. Granted, there still are a lot of questions that have to be answered there as far as what other players get extended by the Leafs before the expansion draft. And there is always the chance a guy like Dermott could be someone that they look at as a potential change in scenery type of guy with a bigger upside than what he's shown in Toronto. As far as the possibility of a side deal or trade with Toronto, I don't know that that's terribly likely. Really, the only scenario in which I see Toronto maybe seeking that out is if they really want to keep both Campbell and Anderson and don't see any way to do it without making a trade. But in that unlikely scenario that Toronto does decide to go the route of trying to make a trade with Seattle, they are a bit light on draft picks, so we're probably looking at more trading a prospect here. And if they were to decide to go that route, then there's any number of guys that could be on their way to Seattle, with really the only guy I think being particularly safe from a trade there would be Rasmus Sandin, who is exempt from the draft. With that said though, we have reached the end of this one, so if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section on who you think the Leafs will protect, or who could end up in Seattle. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.